"Sir, you look like you need him more than I do," the little girl said softly. And in that instant, the entire marble lobby of the Carter Grand Hotel seemed to lose its sound. As if the world itself had paused to listen, Amara Johnson stood barefoot on polished stone that reflected chandeliers like frozen stars, her small hands wrapped tightly around a worn teddy bear with faded brown fur and a stitched ear. She was 7 years old, but carried herself with a quiet steadiness that made people pause without understanding why. In front of her stood William Carter, a billionaire known across New York for building an empire out of numbers, negotiations, and silence. A man who rarely stopped walking for anything or anyone. Yet he had stopped completely, his eyes fixed not on the child herself, but on the teddy bear she held out, as if it were the most natural offering in the world. Around them, the lobby continued its life in fragments. Heels tapping, phones buzzing, distant conversation floating like background noise. But everything near them felt suspended. Amara tilted her head slightly and repeated in a gentle voice, "You can take him. I think he's lonely too." William blinked once, then twice. As though trying to process a language he had forgotten he once understood, his assistant stepped forward slightly, whispering that they were already late for a board meeting. But William raised one hand without looking away from the child, silencing the motion with a simple gesture. Amara did not flinch. She simply held the teddy bear higher, her small arms steady despite the weight of it. And for reasons she could not have known, William's attention dropped fully to the toy. Its fabric was worn thin at the edges, one button eye slightly loose, stitches visible like quiet scars of time. Something about it pulled at him in a way that made the noise of his world feel suddenly distant. He crouched slowly, not because he needed to, but because something inside him told him he should, bringing himself down to her height, so their eyes could meet without distance. "What's his name?" he asked quietly, almost surprised by his own voice. Amara thought for a moment and answered, "I just call him Mr. Bear. He listens better than most people." A faint breath of something almost like amusement passed through William's expression, but it faded quickly into something more thoughtful as he reached out carefully, not touching the toy yet, just hovering near it as if unsure whether he was allowed to enter the space she had created. "Why would you give him to me?" he asked, and Amara looked at him as though the answer was obvious. "Because you look like you forgot something important," she said, and those words landed heavier than anything he had heard in years of meetings or contracts. Around them, a few hotel guests slowed their pace, sensing something unusual but not understanding what it was. William Carter, the man who owned buildings people worked their entire lives inside, was being studied by a child who owned nothing but a patched-up teddy bear. And yet somehow she stood with the confidence of someone who had already decided what mattered in the world. William finally took the teddy bear gently into his hands, expecting to feel nothing more than fabric and stuffing. But instead he felt something unexpectedly grounding, a strange warmth that did not belong to the object itself but to the memory it stirred, a memory he had not visited in decades, of a simpler time when life was measured in afternoons rather than acquisitions, when silence was not filled with responsibility but with possibility. He looked back at Amara and noticed her watching him, carefully, not with expectation, but with calm certainty, as if she had already done what she came to do. "Where did you learn to give something like this away?" he asked, and she shrugged slightly. "My mom says when someone looks like they carry too much, you help them carry less." William's gaze softened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time in a very long time he did not think about schedules, investors, or consequences. Instead, he thought about the weight he had been carrying for years without noticing it had become unbearable. The assistant shifted again, more urgently now, but William did not move. He simply looked at the teddy bear in his hands, and then back at the small girl standing in front of him as if she had offered him something far greater than a toy. She had offered him a reminder. And in that quiet exchange, something inside him began to shift in a way no boardroom ever had the power to accomplish. Amara stepped back slightly, as though her part in the moment was complete, her voice gentle one last time. "He can stay with you if you want, but don't forget to listen to him." And then she turned as if ready to walk away from the most expensive lobby in the city and back into a life that carried none of its weight. William remained still, holding the teddy bear in his hands as though it had suddenly become the most fragile and important thing in the room. And for the first time in years, he did not immediately know what to do next, only that something had just changed in a way he could not yet name. William Carter stood motionless in the middle of the hotel lobby, the teddy bear resting in his hands like something unexpectedly fragile, and for a long moment he simply stared at it, as if it had quietly rewritten the rules of the world he thought he understood. Around him the building continued its polished rhythm, elevators chiming softly, guests moving with purpose, the distant hum of conversation blending into a refined background noise, but none of it reached him the way it used to. His assistant, Daniel Reed, approached again, this time more cautiously, adjusting his tie as he spoke in a controlled but urgent tone. "Mr. Carter, the board meeting in Manhattan is scheduled to begin in 30 minutes. The investors are already assembled." William did not respond immediately, his attention still anchored to the small stitched bear in his hands. He turned it slightly, noticing how one ear leaned lower than the other, as if time itself had gently bent it out of shape. "Cancel it," he said finally, his voice calm but absolute. Daniel blinked, momentarily unsure if he had heard correctly. "Sir, the European acquisition discussion has been postponed twice already, and the partners are expecting your final approval today." William exhaled slowly, still not looking up. "I said cancel it." The words were not loud, but they carried a certainty that made further argument unnecessary. Daniel hesitated, then stepped aside to make the call, still visibly confused. Across the lobby, Amara Johnson had reached the entrance doors, her small figure framed briefly against the bright afternoon light outside. She paused only for a second before stepping forward, but something made her stop again, as if she had forgotten whether she was supposed to look back. She turned her head slightly and saw William still holding Mr. Bear, not as someone examining an object, but as someone trying to understand a feeling he could not name. For a brief moment their eyes met across the distance, and Amara offered a small nod, simple and quiet, like a final confirmation of something only she understood. Then she left, disappearing into the movement of the city beyond the glass doors. William remained still long after she was gone, and the lobby slowly returned to its normal rhythm around him. Yet something within him had not returned with it. Daniel approached, again, lowering his voice. "Sir, should I arrange security to follow up on the child, or contact social services just to ensure she is safe?" William shook his head slightly. "No, not yet," he replied, and then after a pause added, "Find out everything you can about her, but discreetly." Daniel nodded, though the instruction carried a weight that suggested this was no longer a routine request. William finally looked away from the entrance and walked toward the private lounge adjacent to the lobby, the teddy bear still in his hand. When he entered the room, the sound changed instantly, becoming softer, insulated from the city outside. He sat down near the window without removing his coat, placing the bear carefully on the table in front of him as though it might move if handled too quickly. Sunlight filtered through tall glass panels, falling across the toy in uneven patterns, and William found himself staring at it again, not for what it was, but for what it represented. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, not sharp or painful, but distant and warm, of a small apartment years ago, of a simpler version of himself who once believed time was abundant and people stayed longer than they do. He remembered holding something similar once, though he could not clearly recall when or why it had been lost, only the absence it left behind. Daniel entered quietly with a tablet in hand. "I made the calls, sir. Everything is being rescheduled, but the partners are not pleased." William nodded absently, his eyes still on the teddy bear. "They will adjust," he said, and then after a moment he added, almost to himself, "Everyone adjusts." Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "Forgive me, sir, but this is unlike you. You have never canceled a board meeting for anything." William finally leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting toward the window where the city moved endlessly forward. "That is precisely the problem," he said quietly. Daniel did not respond. Sensing that no further explanation would be offered, William stood after a moment and walked toward the glass, looking down at the street below where thousands of people moved like threads in a larger pattern, each one carrying something unseen. He thought again of Amara, of how easily she had given something so worn yet meaningful without hesitation. As if value was not measured by cost but by intention, he returned to the table and picked up the teddy bear once more, holding it closer this time, not as an object of curiosity, but as something that had found its way into a place it did not belong yet somehow fit perfectly. She said I forgot something important. He murmured softly. Daniel glanced up, but said nothing. William continued after a pause. I think she might be right. And in that quiet admission there was no grand realization, no dramatic shift, only the beginning of something subtle and unfamiliar, like a door that had not been opened in years finally allowing light to slip through its edges. The afternoon light outside the Carter Grand Hotel had shifted slightly, stretching longer across the glass facade as William Carter remained in the private lounge, still holding the small teddy bear as if it had become an anchor he did not realize he needed. The city beyond the window continued its endless motion, taxis flowing through intersections, pedestrians crossing with hurried intent. Yet inside that quiet room, everything felt suspended in a different rhythm. Daniel Reed stood near the doorway reviewing messages on his tablet, his expression tightening with each notification as news of canceled meetings and delayed approvals began circulating among executive channels. Finally, he stepped forward carefully. Sir, there is something you should see, he said, his tone more cautious than before. William did not immediately respond, his gaze still resting on the teddy bear placed on the table. But after a moment he turned slightly, signaling him to continue. Daniel hesitated before projecting a short news article onto the screen mounted on the wall. It is not major coverage yet, but it is spreading through internal networks, he explained. The headline referenced a brief moment earlier that afternoon at the hotel lobby involving a child and a high-profile guest. No names were fully confirmed, but enough details had circulated to raise quiet speculation. William's expression did not change outwardly, but his eyes sharpened slightly as he listened. They are calling it a random act of kindness between a child and an unidentified executive, Daniel added. There are already discussions online trying to identify you. William exhaled slowly, then looked away from the screen toward the window again. Let them talk, he said calmly. Daniel lowered the tablet, but remained uncertain. Sir, this kind of attention usually attracts unnecessary scrutiny, especially given your position. William finally turned fully toward him, his voice steady but softer than before. Do you know what attracts more scrutiny than attention? He asked. Daniel paused. Unsure. William continued. Indifference. The room fell silent again. Daniel slowly nodded and stepped back, leaving William alone once more with the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass. He walked toward the table and picked up the teddy bear again, noticing how the afternoon light had shifted across its worn fabric, highlighting every small imperfection as if they were details worth remembering rather than flaws to be fixed. He sat down slowly, his thoughts no longer focused on meetings or markets, but on a small voice from earlier that had said something simple yet unsettlingly clear, that he looked like someone who had forgotten something important. Outside, the city did not pause for reflection, but inside the room William found himself doing exactly that. For the first time in years he began reviewing not his decisions, but his direction, and in that silence the question that lingered was not about what he had built, but about what he had overlooked while building it. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts and Daniel entered once more, this time with a more subdued expression. Sir, our team has identified the child, he said carefully. William looked up immediately, setting the teddy bear down without realizing it. Her name is Amara Johnson, age 7, currently residing in Queens with her mother, Daniel continued. The reports indicate stable conditions, but limited financial resources. William listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable but focused, as though every word was being weighed against something deeper than business logic. When Daniel finished, a brief silence filled the room. William stood slowly and walked toward the window again, looking out at the skyline that had once represented everything he aimed to control, and for the first time it felt distant in a way he could not easily define. Prepare a vehicle, he said finally. Daniel blinked. Sir, William repeated without turning. I want to see her again. There was no hesitation in his voice, only a quiet certainty that surprised even him. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. Yes, sir, he replied, and left the room. William remained by the window for a long moment, the teddy bear still resting on the table behind him, untouched but no longer forgotten. And as the city moved beneath the fading light, something inside him shifted in a way that no contract, no acquisition, and no victory had ever managed to accomplish. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like the beginning of a path he had not known. He needed to walk. The car door closed with a soft, controlled sound as William Carter stepped into the back seat, the city evening already settling into shades of deep blue and amber outside the tinted windows. The vehicle moved smoothly through Manhattan traffic, gliding past illuminated storefronts and crowded sidewalks. Yet inside the car there was an unusual silence that felt heavier than the usual absence of conversation. Daniel Reed sat in the front passenger seat reviewing the route, but even he seemed aware that something about this trip was different from every other executive schedule William had ever followed. William himself sat back against the leather seat, his hands resting loosely near his lap. But his attention was not on the city. It was on a simple thought that had followed him since the hotel lobby. The image of a small girl offering something so ordinary, yet so intentional, that it had disrupted everything he considered normal. After several minutes of quiet driving, Daniel finally spoke carefully. "We are approaching the address in Queens, sir. It is a residential area, modest housing, not far from the industrial district." William gave a slight nod, his eyes still fixed forward. "Park a block away," he said calmly. Daniel acknowledged the instruction without question. The car slowed and eventually stopped near a row of modest apartment buildings where streetlights flickered softly against the pavement. William stepped out first, adjusting his coat as the evening air met him. It was colder here, quieter in a different way than the city center. Less noise, but more presence, as if life here moved at a different pace. Entirely, Daniel followed a few steps behind, but remained respectful distance as William began walking. He had the address, but not a plan. Only a quiet certainty that he needed to be here. They reached a worn entrance door with faded paint and a simple buzzer system. William paused for a brief moment before pressing the button. A faint sound echoed inside, and after a few seconds the door opened slowly, revealing Amara Johnson standing just behind it. She looked slightly surprised but not afraid. Her eyes widened briefly when she recognized him. But there was no panic, only curiosity. She held the same teddy bear now resting against her side, as if it had never left her possession in the first place. William softened his expression immediately, lowering his posture slightly as if to remove any distance his presence naturally created. "Hello again," he said gently. Amara tilted her head slightly. "You came back," she replied simply, as if it was not unexpected but still important. William nodded. "I said I would." Behind her, a woman appeared cautiously, Amara's mother. Observing the scene with quiet concern mixed with uncertainty, Daniel remained near the entrance but did not step forward. William turned slightly toward her and offered a respectful nod. "My name is William Carter," he said calmly. "I met your daughter earlier today." The woman hesitated, unsure how to respond to a man whose name carried weight she could not immediately place. Amara looked up at her mother and then back at William, holding the teddy bear closer. "He wanted to come see if Mr. Bear is still okay," she said softly. William glanced at the toy and then back at her. "I think he is," he replied. And for a brief moment something subtle passed between them. Not transaction, not obligation, but recognition. William continued. "I would like to talk, if that is all right. Just for a few minutes." Amara's mother looked uncertain but eventually stepped aside slightly, allowing them to enter the small apartment. The interior was modest, carefully maintained despite obvious financial strain. Everything arranged with intention rather than excess. William took in the space quietly, not with judgment but observation. Amara sat on a small couch, placing the teddy bear beside her as if it belonged equally to both worlds now. William remained standing for a moment before slowly sitting across from her at a respectful distance. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reflective. Amara broke it first. "You didn't smile much earlier," she said. William paused, then responded honestly. "I do not think I remembered how." Amara considered this seriously, as if it made complete sense. "My mom says people forget things when they are too busy." William looked briefly toward her mother, then back at her. "She is probably right," he admitted. Amara gently patted the teddy bear. "He helps people remember," she said. William glanced at it again, and for the first time since entering the room he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not forced, not rehearsed, but real. Daniel observed quietly from near the doorway, still unsure of his place in a moment that did not belong to business or schedules. William leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. "Amara, can I ask you something?" he said. She nodded without hesitation. "Why did you give him to me?" She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because you looked like you forgot you were not alone." The words were simple, unpolished, and yet they landed with more weight than anything William had heard in years of negotiations or boardroom decisions. He looked down for a moment, absorbing them fully, then nodded slowly. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. And in that small apartment surrounded by ordinary walls and ordinary life, something shifted that no amount of wealth or power had ever managed to reach. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a stillness that felt final and beginning at the same time. The room in the small Queen's apartment remained quiet long after the words had settled between them, as if even the air itself was trying to understand what had just changed. Amara Johnson sat with her hands resting gently on the teddy bear beside her, occasionally smoothing its worn fabric as though it were something alive that needed reassurance. William Carter remained seated across from her, but his posture had shifted since he first entered, less rigid, less distant, as if the invisible walls he usually carried with him had begun to loosen without permission. Amara's mother stood near the kitchen area, still cautious but no longer resistant, observing the strange stillness of a man whose presence usually filled entire rooms with pressure, yet now seemed almost subdued. Daniel Reed remained near the entrance, checking his phone once before realizing no message in his world mattered at this moment. William finally broke the silence with a calm, measured voice. "How long have you lived here?" he asked, not as an interrogation but as an attempt to understand. Amara's mother responded carefully, explaining a timeline of months that had felt longer in lived experience than in numbers: rent difficulties, reduced work hours, the constant balancing of necessities. William listened without interruption, his expression steady but increasingly distant in thought, as though each detail was being placed somewhere inside him that had not been used in years. Amara looked up at him suddenly and asked, "Do you live in a big place?" William paused slightly, then nodded. "Yes," he answered, "very big." She considered this seriously, then said, "Is it loud or quiet?" William thought for a moment before replying honestly, "It is usually quiet." Amara tilted her head. "Quiet can feel empty sometimes," she said, and the simplicity of the statement landed in the room more deeply than expected. William looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded as if acknowledging something he had never put into words before. Daniel shifted slightly at the doorway, checking his watch out of habit but not urgency, realizing time was behaving differently here. William leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, his voice lowering. "Amara, when we met earlier today, you said something about people forgetting things when they are busy." She nodded, gently hugging the teddy bear closer. "Yes," William continued carefully. "What do you think I forgot?" The question was not asked with authority but with genuine curiosity. Amara did not answer immediately. She looked at him with a quiet focus that felt unusually mature for her age, then said softly, "You forgot to look at people like they are people and not problems." The room did not react outwardly, but something inside it shifted. Even Amara's mother lowered her gaze slightly. William absorbed the words without defense, without interruption, as if he had been expecting something like them but had not known when it would arrive. After a long silence, he nodded once, slowly. "That is a difficult truth," he said. Amara replied simply, "Truth is supposed to be." And for the first time, William let out a quiet breath that almost resembled a laugh, but carried no sound of humor, only recognition. He reached into his coat and placed a simple card on the small table in front of him. Not flashy, not excessive, just a clean white card with contact information. "If you ever need anything," he said gently, "anything at all, you can reach me directly." Amara looked at it, but did not immediately take it. Instead, she asked, "Will you still remember me if I do not call?" William hesitated, the question landing deeper than expected, then answered honestly, "Yes, I think I will." She seemed satisfied with that answer and finally took the card. placing it beside the teddy bear as if both items now belonged in the same quiet category of importance. Daniel cleared his throat softly, stepping slightly forward. "Sir, the driver is waiting outside whenever you are ready." William did not move immediately, his attention still on the small girl and the toy beside her. After a moment, he stood slowly, adjusting his coat not as a return to formality, but as a return to awareness. He looked at Amara's mother and nodded respectfully. "Thank you for allowing me to come," he said, then turned his gaze back to Amara. "And thank you for your honesty." Amara simply replied, "You are welcome." As if it were the most natural exchange in the world, William walked toward the door, but paused briefly before stepping out, glancing back one final time, seeing the teddy bear resting between the child and the table like a quiet bridge between two entirely different lives. Then he stepped into the hallway, Daniel following closely behind. As the door closed softly behind them, the sounds of the apartment returned to normal, but William stood still for a moment longer in the dim corridor, as if the world outside was no longer moving at quite the same speed it had before he entered that room. The night outside the Queen's apartment had deepened into a calm, muted blue, with streetlights casting long reflections across wet pavement as William Carter and Daniel Reed stepped out of the building and into the quiet air. The city now felt different to William, less like a structure of power and motion and more like a layered collection of lives happening simultaneously beyond his attention. Daniel walked slightly behind him as they moved toward the waiting car, but William's pace was slower than before, almost reflective, as if each step was no longer just movement but consideration. When they reached the vehicle, the driver opened the door immediately, but William paused before entering, his gaze drifting back toward the building they had just left, Amara's image lingering in his mind with unusual clarity. Daniel noticed the pause, but said nothing, respecting the silence that seemed to follow William more frequently now. Once inside the car, William did not immediately speak. Instead, he looked out through the tinted window as the city lights passed by in soft streaks. Daniel finally broke the silence carefully. "Sir, the team has prepared a full briefing for tomorrow morning, including revised schedules and investor responses regarding today's cancellations." William did not respond right away, then finally said, "Reschedule everything again." Daniel blinked slightly. "Sir," William continued calmly, "not indefinitely, just until further notice." Daniel hesitated but nodded, making notes silently. The car continued forward through Manhattan streets that were gradually thinning as they moved away from the busiest districts. William leaned back into the seat, his hands resting together but not tense. Instead, there was an unusual stillness in him, as if something internal had shifted its center of gravity. After several minutes, he spoke again, not to Daniel, but almost to himself. "Do you ever wonder what changes a person more, success or silence?" Daniel looked slightly surprised by the question, but answered carefully. "Most people would say success, sir." William nodded slowly. "That is what I used to believe." The car passed under a bridge, momentarily dimming the light inside, and in that brief shadow, William's thoughts returned again to Amara, to the way she had spoken without hesitation, without calculation, as if truth did not require permission. He remembered her words about forgetting people, and for the first time he did not dismiss them as simplicity, but considered them as clarity. When the car finally reached his residence in Upper Manhattan, the gates opened automatically, revealing the large estate that usually represented control, privacy, and precision, but tonight it felt slightly unfamiliar. William stepped out and walked slowly toward the entrance, Daniel following at a respectful distance. Inside the house, the lighting was warm but restrained, every object carefully placed, every surface reflecting order. Yet William stopped in the middle of the main hall, and for the first time looked at it differently, not as ownership, but as absence of something he could not immediately name. He walked past the staircase and into his private study where the atmosphere was quieter still. He placed his coat aside and stood near the window overlooking the city skyline. From this height, everything looked structured and complete, but somehow distant. Daniel entered quietly and placed a folder on the desk. "Everything requested has been updated, sir," he said. William nodded without turning. "Thank you, Daniel. You can rest for the evening." Daniel hesitated, then left the room, closing the door softly behind him. William remained by the window, but his attention shifted not to the skyline, but to the reflection of the room behind him. He saw the vast space, the expensive furniture, the carefully maintained order, and for the first time it did not feel like achievement, it felt like separation. He walked slowly to his desk and opened a drawer. After a moment of searching, he found a blank sheet of paper. Something he had not used in years. He placed it on the desk and simply looked at it for a long time, as if waiting for instruction that did not arrive. Then he sat down and wrote one line without hesitation. Not a business note, not a plan, just a simple thought. After finishing, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. The teddy bear Amara had given him sat on the edge of the desk, where he had placed it earlier, unnoticed by him at first, but now fully visible. He picked it up again and held it in one hand, not as an object of sentiment, but as a reminder of something he was only beginning to understand. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, but inside the room William Carter remained still, no longer entirely certain that motion alone was enough to define direction. The first light of morning spread across Manhattan in a muted gold haze, touching the glass towers and long avenues with a quiet glow that felt almost softer than usual, as if the city itself had slowed down overnight. Inside William Carter's residence, the silence was uninterrupted, except for the faint ticking of a distant clock that seemed louder than it should have been. William stood in his private study near the window, holding the teddy bear loosely in one hand while the other rested against the edge of his desk. His gaze was not focused on the skyline today, but on something closer, something internal. Daniel Reed entered quietly after a brief knock, holding a tablet as usual, but he stopped when he noticed William was not immediately acknowledging him. After a moment, William spoke without turning. "Cancel all external meetings for the rest of the week." Daniel paused, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Sir, the West Coast investors are expecting final confirmation, and the European partners are still waiting on your revised statement." William turned slightly now, his expression calm but certain. "They will wait longer." Daniel hesitated but nodded, making adjustments on his tablet. The room returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It carried weight, reflection, and something closer to intention. William finally sat at his desk and placed the teddy bear beside a blank sheet of paper that remained untouched from the night before. He stared at it for a long time before speaking softly, almost as if testing the words in his mind. "I want to understand something." Daniel looked up. "Sir," William continued, "how many decisions do we make every day without ever seeing the people they affect?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Recognizing that this was not a question requiring data, William did not wait for a response either. Instead, he stood again and walked slowly toward the window, the city below already fully awake, moving with its usual urgency. Yet from here it felt distant, like a system running independently of the life inside this room. William's thoughts returned again to Amara Johnson, not as a memory of an encounter, but as a presence that had stayed with him longer than expected. He remembered her voice, steady and simple, speaking about people being forgotten when life becomes too busy. He had not dismissed it anymore. Instead, he had begun to examine it. Daniel broke the silence gently. "Sir, there is also something else. Our team has confirmed additional details about the child's situation." William turned slightly, attentive. Daniel continued. "Her school attendance has been irregular due to financial instability, and her mother has been managing multiple part-time jobs. They are currently stable but vulnerable." William listened without interruption, and when Daniel finished, he nodded once, slowly. "Arrange a meeting," he said. Daniel looked up. "With the mother," William confirmed. "Yes, not through intermediaries, directly." Daniel hesitated briefly before acknowledging. "Understood, sir," and began preparing the arrangements. William returned to his desk and sat down again, this time picking up the teddy bear and placing it directly in front of him, as if it were part of the conversation he was having with himself. The room felt quieter now, but not empty. Instead, it carried a sense of direction forming, without clarity yet. Later that afternoon, William left the residence without announcement, accompanied only by Daniel and a driver. The vehicle moved through the city once again, but this time William was not observing buildings or schedules. He was observing people, the way they moved through sidewalks, the way they interacted in small, unnoticed moments. A man helping another carry groceries, a child holding onto a parent's hand tightly, while crossing a street. Small details he had once filtered out without thought now seemed more present. When they arrived near a modest community center in Queens, the car slowed. William stepped out alone while Daniel remained near the vehicle. The building was simple, worn but active, with people coming and going in steady rhythm. William stood for a moment at the entrance before entering. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, filled with the sound of quiet conversation and movement, and after a few seconds he saw her, Amara Johnson, sitting at a small table with a few other children, the teddy bear placed carefully beside her as if it had become part of her space rather than an object. When she noticed him, she did not react with surprise, only a small, calm recognition. William approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. Amara looked up and said softly, "You came again." William nodded. "I did," he replied. Then after a brief pause added, "I wanted to see how your day was going." She considered this seriously before answering. "It is normal." William smiled faintly at her choice of words, then asked, "What does normal mean to you?" Amara thought for a moment. "It means nothing bad happened." William absorbed that answer quietly, understanding more in that simplicity than in any report he had read that day. The room around them continued its ordinary rhythm. But for William Carter, nothing about this moment felt ordinary anymore. And as he stood there speaking with a child who measured life differently than he did, he began to realize that change did not always arrive as disruption. Sometimes it arrived as understanding that had been missing all along. The afternoon in Queens carried a different kind of rhythm than Manhattan, slower, softer, filled with the distant sounds of neighborhood life rather than the sharp urgency of business districts. William Carter stood near the entrance of the community center watching as children moved in and out of rooms, their voices blending into a calm background of activity. Amara Johnson sat at a small table near the window, still beside the worn teddy bear she never seemed to leave behind. Daniel Reed remained outside with the vehicle, giving William space he would not have asked for in any previous context. William slowly approached her again, not with the posture of a businessman, but with the careful uncertainty of someone entering a world he did not fully understand. Amara looked up as he arrived and offered a small wave, simple and natural, as if his presence there had become something expected rather than surprising. William nodded and took a seat across from her at the small table, adjusting slightly to fit into a space that was clearly not designed for him. After a brief silence, he asked gently, "Do you come here every day?" Amara nodded. "After school," she replied, then added, "Sometimes before if my mom is working." William absorbed that without interruption, his gaze briefly shifting to the teddy bear resting between them, then back to her. "Do you like it here?" he asked. Amara thought for a moment before answering. "It is okay. People share snacks." "Sometimes." William smiled faintly at that. Not because it was humorous, but because of how matter-of-fact it was, as if kindness was simply part of the environment rather than something exceptional. A staff member nearby glanced toward William with recognition, whispering briefly to another volunteer, but William did not react. Instead, he remained focused on Amara. "What do you usually do here?" he asked. She pointed toward a small shelf of books and art supplies. "We draw, and sometimes we read stories." William nodded slowly, as if observing something he had once known but had long forgotten how to access. A short pause followed before Amara suddenly asked, "Do you still have Mr. Bear?" William looked slightly surprised by the question, then answered honestly, "Yes, I do." Amara seemed satisfied with that response and returned her attention to the teddy bear beside her, gently adjusting its position so it faced them both. William watched her quietly for a moment before speaking. "Again, why did you give him to me?" Amara did not hesitate this time. "Because you needed to remember something," she said simply. William leaned back slightly, considering the answer, then asked, "And what did I need to remember?" Amara looked at him directly, her expression calm but certain. "That people are not just what they do, they are what they feel." The words settled in the space between them without resistance, and for a moment William did not respond. Instead, he looked down at his hands, then toward the teddy bear, then back at her, as if aligning pieces of understanding that had never been placed together before. Outside the window, the city continued its movement, but inside the small community center, the moment felt paused in a way that was difficult to describe. William finally spoke quietly. "That is a very important thing to know." Amara nodded as if that was already understood, then returned to her drawing. Continuing her simple activity without further concern, William remained seated longer than he had planned, observing the space not as an outsider evaluating structure, but as someone beginning to recognize meaning in ordinary things. When Daniel eventually stepped inside to signal that they needed to leave soon, William did not immediately stand. Instead, he looked once more at Amara and said, "I will come back." She looked up briefly and replied, "Okay," without expectation or surprise. As if promises were simply part of continuity rather than exception, William finally stood, and as he walked toward the exit, he did not look back immediately. But when he reached the door, he paused and turned one last time, seeing her still seated with the teddy bear beside her, completely at ease in a world that no longer felt entirely separate from his own. And in that quiet moment, William Carter understood that something fundamental had begun to shift, not in the world around him, but in the way he was beginning to see it. The evening sky over Queens had deepened into a calm gradient of indigo and fading orange as William Carter's car moved slowly back through the neighborhood streets. The city now felt different to him than it had just days before, less like a system of buildings and transactions and more like a living network of stories unfolding in parallel. Daniel Reed sat quietly in the front seat reviewing a few final messages, but even he had stopped speaking as frequently, sensing that William's attention was no longer anchored in the same world of urgency it once was. Inside the back seat, William rested against the leather interior, but his gaze was not on his phone or the documents Daniel had prepared. Instead, it was distant, reflective, as if replaying a series of moments that no longer felt separate from each other. The hotel lobby, the teddy bear, the small apartment, the community center, all merging into a single continuous thread that he could not ignore anymore. After several minutes of silence, Daniel finally spoke carefully. "Sir, tomorrow morning's briefing includes updated financial projections and stakeholder responses. Everything is aligned for your approval if you choose to proceed." William did not respond immediately, then finally said quietly, "Postpone it again." Daniel hesitated slightly. "Indefinitely," William clarified, his voice steady but without its usual executive sharpness. Daniel nodded without further question, typing the adjustment into his device. The car continued forward through the residential streets, passing streetlights and small storefronts, until William suddenly spoke again. "Daniel." Daniel turned slightly. "Yes, sir." William paused, choosing his words carefully. "How long have I been measuring everything in terms of efficiency instead of meaning?" Daniel did not answer right away. Sensing this was not a request for data, William continued without waiting. "I think I stopped noticing people at some point." There was no regret in his tone, only recognition. The car slowed as they approached the hotel district again, the familiar glass structure of the Carter Grand Hotel coming into view in the distance, illuminated against the night sky like a monument of precision and control. When they arrived, the driver opened the door and William stepped out. But instead of entering immediately, he stood still for a moment, looking at the building not as an owner or operator, but as someone observing it from outside for the first time. Daniel stood beside him quietly, unsure whether to speak. William finally walked forward into the lobby, the same polished marble, the same controlled movement of staff and guests, yet it felt subtly different now, less like a place of authority and more like a place of separation. As he crossed the lobby, a few employees recognized him and immediately adjusted their posture, but William did not acknowledge it in the usual way. Instead, he continued walking until he reached the private lounge where he had once sat holding the teddy bear. He entered and paused. The room was unchanged, quiet, refined, perfectly arranged, but now it no longer felt like it belonged entirely to him. Daniel followed and stood near the entrance. "Sir, should I prepare anything for tomorrow?" William looked toward the window where the city lights stretched endlessly across Manhattan, then slowly shook his head. "No," he said, then added after a moment, "I want to go back to Queens tomorrow." Daniel nodded, though he did not fully understand the direction this was taking. William walked toward the table where the teddy bear had once been placed. It was still there, positioned carefully as if it had never left that spot. He picked it up slowly and held it for a moment, not with hesitation but with understanding. Then he spoke quietly, almost as if confirming something to himself. "I think I understand what she meant now." Daniel watched silently. Not interrupting, William continued. It was never about what I built. He paused, looking at the bear, then toward the window again. It was about what I ignored while building it. The room remained silent, but it no longer felt empty. Instead, it felt like something had been added rather than removed. William placed the teddy bear back on the table, but this time carefully, deliberately, as if acknowledging its place rather than simply storing it. He turned to Daniel and said, "Tomorrow, we are not going to a meeting." Daniel nodded. "Where are we going, sir?" William looked once more at the city beyond the glass, then replied softly, "We are going to listen." And in that moment, without announcement or ceremony, the direction of everything he had known began to change in a way that could not be measured by numbers or schedules, only by understanding.